The auroras are out, and you know what that means. It's time for another episode of Aurora Airwaves. Hi everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Jordan Bianchi, our host, and I'm delighted to have you back again, with me under the stars. I want to spend time this week sharing an example of my Aurora energy, one of my deepest passions and loves, with you. In our last episode, we met Sara Burgess, a friend of mine from Los Angeles who focuses on digital marketing and has a deep history of acting and the creative arts. In 2019, when I learned she was a voice actress, I invited her to lend her voice for tests for a character I had written in my narrative podcast, The Midnight Hearth. As I mentioned in the last episode, this project came about when I had left New York City, and I left bountiful opportunities behind to learn how to write on my own. After 2 years, I realized that I had become trapped by limitations I was putting on myself. Namely, I was forcing myself to write only what I could produce as a film. And as everyone knows, when you leave film school, you realize how expensive filmmaking really costs. So, one day, I allowed myself to create a story world that was pure and stemmed directly from my imagination. I wrote about 150 random ideas, funny, dark, serious, solemn, mystic, with the intention that whatever I wrote had to make its way into this story. A 20-page short story came to life from my ideas and began as a frame narrative for an anthology podcast of ghost stories. But quickly I saw a much bigger story and world coming to life. As I began to develop the larger project, before bringing on my co-writer, Amanda Bintz, with whom I've been writing it since the onset of the pandemic in 2020, Sara and I teamed up to bring moments in that short story to life. I can recall listening to her first tests while sitting next to a wood-burning stove at a friend's house, filling up with so much energy I hadn't felt in so long. This story was coming to life. What I learned in that moment is that creating art is not enough to feel balanced. We must create our art for ourselves, yes, and pour as much of the weird and wild and wondrous auroras that swirl within us into our creations. But we must share them with others, and sometimes let the people that we share them with breathe fresh life into our ideas. This is the power of collaboration. When we think about collaboration, we often think of individuals teaming up to finish a project. But collaboration and coexisting, these are examples of sharing. And it's the process of letting ourselves be vulnerable and opening up into the world. The secret that we can discover is that we are the world. There is no separation. And when we collaborate, we reunite with the deepest parts of ourselves that have always needed nurturing and will always need nurturing. The question always arises, why do we hold on to art that we've created, whether it's finished or it's not? What I've found in my career is that it takes a lot longer to make something than I anticipate. And I know for myself, I have a tendency for projects to grow and grow and grow, and then they never see the light of day. There are moments when my light pours into these projects, and the frustration storms within me when I know that my light is within these projects, but no one is seeing them. At this point in my career, I feel that it's beneficial to share works in progress, to share tests, to share the bits and pieces of projects that we're working on for the sake of them being seen. Stories are meant to be heard. Art is meant to be experienced. And even if it's not complete, nothing bad is going to happen from the world seeing it. If criticisms are given to an unfinished project or even a completed project, it's only a trigger that currently exists within us that is triggered. By releasing works, whatever stage they're in, we get to experience our triggers based on the reactions of other people in the communities that we share our work within. And what a beautiful thing. We can see what aspects of us need healing, where the wounds are, where the growth needs to be, for the ego to be silenced and calmed. and our true light can let out into the world. Aurora Airwaves is dedicated to encourage everyone who listens, including you, that it is okay for you to let your light out, that you are safe, that the only person who will judge your work is yourself. And that's okay if you do, because all it is fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of who you might see yourself to be. But as I said in the first episode, our shadows and our light are a part of us, and we must love them because they're us. So this is your gentle nudge to love yourself, to share yourself. For years I held on to these character tests, and now I'm delighted to share them with you all. As this podcast takes form, different auroras in the forms of stories, projects, and the like will swirl through these airwaves to you. Conversations with many talented artists and creators will make their way to you in the coming weeks, along with many of our auroras. For now, I hope you enjoy Sara's character tests for the Midnight Hearth. The Midnight Hearth short story and music was written and composed by me, Jordan Bianchi. Performed by Sara Burgess and Keith Gallucci. Scores arranged and performed by Jay Bianchi and Dave Heath.
The silhouetted mountain range in the distance, bent like the spine of a dragon. I imagine the beast, with leathery wings and emerald scales, in a heavy slumber, resting among the evergreen trees of the forest that surrounded it. Their needles held fresh snow that had fallen in the afternoon sun. The clear, frozen lake we were traveling around mirrored its bony back, as well as the clouds that hung overhead. I rode aboard the Indigo Express, a Victorian locomotive that was painted the color of a regal peacock and decorated with gilded lettering. We'd departed the city northbound over 11 hours ago. My eyes kept closing even though I tried to fight it. There were still many hours to go before we'd arrive in St. Genevieve. St. Genevieve was a walled town, fortified in the 16th century and hidden behind the western side of the Dragon's Spine. Descendants of its founders still lived within its walls. The only connection it had to the outside world was by train. There were no roads for automobiles and no safe landing zones for zeppelins. Trust me, I checked. Apart from the Indigo's rails, the rocky terrain and dense forests had yet to be tamed. I breathed in tobacco. The train chugged on. All around me, the world slept. Then came the Great Reef War that split us apart. We were forced to postpone our wedding once he was conscripted to serve out at sea. But still, he wrote. He always wrote to me. He wrote about who he'd met and what adventures he and his fellow soldiers had seen in the tropics. How large the insects were, the salty water, the dishes they discovered in the villages, and his love of meeting the locals. It never mattered the situation. Gabriel always found the gems that everyone else overlooked. Then, after years of agony and loneliness and the siege of the Serpent Sea, the time finally came. The soldiers were coming home. Unknowingly, they didn't return alone. The dining car had rows of booths with tablecloths and high leather seats that framed each window. Apart from the waiter at the far end who folded napkins as he listened to a small radio, it was empty. I slid into a booth and clicked on the table lamp. I ordered Turkish coffee and a scone when the waiter asked. A paper, too, if they had one. I took the cigarette box from the inner pocket of my jacket. The weight in my fingers told me I was down to the last of the pack. I lit one, tossed the carton onto the table, and cherished each puff in long breaths. I had no idea where they'd be sold in this part of the world. Maybe I'd be lucky. Maybe I'd have to barter. My drink let off steam as the waiter poured it into my cup. The scone had raspberries in it. The stories in the paper were from back before I first boarded the Indigo, but I read them anyway. Underneath the glow of a copper lamppost, a young man shoveled a pathway to the station. He wore an old ski suit and a hat with flaps that hid his ears. When I asked, he pointed me in the direction of town and told me how to find the tavern. Whew. The road had not been plowed. It was buried in snow nearly up to my knees. I was forced to trudge on through the carriage road as it fed into the forest. I covered my face with my scarf as best I could, but the wind still stung. I anchored my boots in the snow with each step to try to keep my balance. The forest was dense and dark, and it was silent. There were no owls, no birds, and thankfully no howls of wolves. There were still wolves here in the north. They appeared in many of the stories Gabriel had collected. The carriage road I walked on was just a minuscule slice amidst the endless acreage of wilderness. I felt the towering trees constrict my loneliness into dread. The isolation was inescapable. After a time, the forest opened to a clearing where it met a billboard that spelled out, "The Village of Osiris welcomes you." It was clear that this was a celebrated beacon in the past, but time had had its way with it. Unlit bulbs, mostly broken, surrounded the structure. Each letter, painted with regality in orange and turquoise, had faded and peeled. Twin winged lions struck poses on either end. Each had chips in their feathers, yet they still looked up to the sky. When I passed the welcome sign, I thought I heard something. An animal? There had to be something in the woods. I looked out past the trail, and I saw a figure. She seemed to glide as she walked along the trees. She was covered in robes that were as wispy and delicate as falling snow. A white shawl covered her face. In the lack of light, I swore her skin looked blue. I realized then that she was crying. I called out to her to see if she needed help. But as soon as I did, I couldn't see her. Was she hiding from me? I looked for her around the trees. The snow around the roots had no footprints in it. I called again, but received no reply. She was gone. Confused and cold, I walked on. He removed a black and white photograph that hung above the bar and showed it to me. It was of the village many years ago. I could tell its age by the vintage clothes the subjects wore and cracks in the film. But instead of being on the brink of a ghost town as it was now, it was filled with people. Hundreds of people. Carnival lights were strung from rooftop to rooftop, and vendors, carnies, lined the streets. Families joyously bustled up and down the streets as signs for rides blinked Arabian Frights and chariot bumper cars. A robed man twisted balloons in the forms of birds, crocodiles, and four-legged cats. Osiris's statue was covered in flowers. It was almost unrecognizable. This isn't Osiris, is it?
Indeed it is. In its heyday. This was the Carnival of Sister Egypt.
In the photo, a parade masquerading as a royal procession was coming down the carriage road. Attendees waved their straw hats and papier-mâché headdresses joyously to a man who was seated in a throne atop a sphinx-shaped float, as it was pulled by a team of donkeys. Atop his head was a white, bulbous crown, adorned with tall feathers the shade of red desert sand. He held instruments of the same shapes that I'd seen in the hands of the statue outside.
Thank you for tuning into this episode. If you haven't already, please take just 20 seconds to give us a 5-star rating. It'll help us grow, it really will. And we welcome you to join our Aurora Airwaves community on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. I'll see you next time, which will be right around the corner. And don't forget, there are auroras within you. Not only does the world want to see your light, it wants you to experience it for yourself. What will you create this week? Maybe it's a piece of art. Or maybe it's a phone call to a friend you haven't spoken to in a while. Maybe it's letting yourself read that book you've been wanting to dive into. And maybe it's saying something nice to yourself. However your auroras choose to emanate, we hope you enjoy them.